everyone, Dorvald here with another Great Weapons lesson video for you. Let me first start with my standard disclaimer. I am not a believer in the one true way of doing anything. This is my way. Take whatever works for you and keep it, whatever doesn't work for you and discard it. Okay, disclaimer out of the way. Now what this video is going to be about in terms of great weapons is weapon size or length and usage. One of the very common questions I get from newer fighters is very much like when they ask about shields. What size shield should I have? And they're looking for absolute dimensions. Well, just like with shields, there really isn't an absolute measurement for great weapons. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that to you. First of all, for context, within the Society for Creative Anachronism, great weapons have a maximum length of 7.5 feet down to roughly about 4 feet, I believe, is the cutoff. Essentially, then, you've got the really short great weapons like the two-handed axe, two-handed maul, and bastard swords of different sizes. And then again, all the way up to 7.5 feet, which is where you have your halberds, your glaives, and some other assorted weapons. Now, historically, this is why it makes it so difficult to give you any kind of an absolute when it comes to length and measurement. Historically, the Society of Creative Anachronism covers essentially all cultures around the world from 1600 back. That is a long range of both cultures and time periods to cover. And great weapons have run the gamut in terms of length, size of striking head, weight, and so on. It really depended on what kind of an opponent you were going to be facing. Did they wear armor? Did they not wear armor? If they wore armor, what kind of armor did they wear? In terms of the usage, what were you using it for? Was it predominantly meant to be used for fighting one-on-one, or was it meant to be used in formation in large battles? All of these things contributed to the design, the length, the weight, the heads of all of these various great weapons. So that's the historical side of it. When it comes to the Society of Creative Anachronism, though, it's a slightly different dynamic. Now, mainly what I mean by that is, let me give you a for instance. Say your opponent is wearing full plate armor. You're using a great weapon. You want a weapon with enough mass and with such a concentrated striking area that you can do damage through the armor into them, whether that's by penetrating the armor, crushing the armor, or simply the shock of impact being bad enough to cause damage beneath the armor. Believe me, that can absolutely happen. Transmission shock from a concentrated blow can break ribs and damage organs, even if the armor itself holds up. Well, in the SCA, obviously, we're not trying to do the same thing. We're not trying to literally kill our opponents or injure or cripple them. And the weapons that we're using are not going to cause that kind of damage to an opponent. Now, if your opponent has no armor or virtually no armor on, then you don't need a weapon that has that much impact force. And so you might be looking for a weapon that has not such a concentrated striking head, but something with a longer cutting surface to cause the maximum size wound in your opponent. Well, again, in the SCA, we're not quite looking for that. We're not really looking to open up a huge gash in our opponent. We're using rattan, and we're doing this for fun or for sport. We're not doing this in a life or death situation to harm anyone. So, let's get more specifically into the SCA. When it comes to the SCA, we have basically two usages for great weapons. We have singles fighting, challenges, tournaments, and we have group fighting, melee war. So the length of your weapon has a great deal to do with what usage you want to put it to. Are you looking for something to use primarily for single fighting, or are you wanting to look for something to use in melee or war? So I'm going to give you some pointers to help you try and determine what that length should be or what you should experiment with. Now, I'm rather noted with most of my friends for having an arsenal. I've got a massive number of weapons, both single-handed weapons and great weapons of many different lengths and size of striking heads and so on, because I have them for doing different things. And that's given me a lot of perspective in trying to advise someone, especially someone new, in their choice of great weapons. So if we're assuming that a person per se doesn't have the kind of money it takes to have a lot of different weapons, so it wants kind of multi-use weapons, I'm hoping that some of this will help translate for you to decide what might be best. Now, the only real advantage in our game, in the SCA, against someone with a shield when using a great weapon is range and leverage. Now, leverage isn't going to play a big part of what I'm talking about here, but we're going to talk about that range. All right? If you're fighting somebody who's using a shield and a single-handed weapon, realistically, most of the time, they're going to be able to move that single-handed weapon a bit faster than you're going to be able to move a two-handed weapon. Even though you've got two hands on it, length and mass can really slow down your response with that weapon. So things like a halberd, a 7.5 foot long halberd, doesn't work so well one-on-one against someone with a shield. Once they get past that initial strike range that you've got, if you cannot maintain your significant range advantage on them, they're going to be able to close, and that speed of weapon is going to take a really major advantage away from you. So you want to have some range, but you don't necessarily want to be slow in response to your opponent. Plus, if you've got something that's 7.5 feet long, by the time your opponent is right up in front of you, right on top of you, all that length now is working against you, because now you've got to figure out some way to choke up to get closer to the head to be able to strike your opponent. We don't allow quarterstaff style strikes in the SCA, so you can't take and just slap them across the head with the side or haft of your weapon and flatten them out. That may be able to be true in a real fight, life or death situation, but we do restrict some things for safety in the game that we play. So, you want to have a weapon that's long enough to give you an advantage over your opponent, but you don't want it to be so long or have so much mass that it's difficult for you to be able to fight with them once they're up close. Now, halberds and glaives and spears that are in that 7.5 foot range are really good in warfare, especially if you're fighting in groups and units where you've got shieldmen that can interpose themselves between you and your opponent. So now you're actually able to, in effect, double or triple team somebody because you've got people that are protecting you, but you can reach past them and attack your opponent. So again, the range of the weapon is really dependent on the usage that you want it for. Are you wanting it for singles fights, or are you wanting it for war melee? So when it comes again to the singles fighting, I have typically found that anything that's over 6 feet in length can put you at a disadvantage. I have generally found one-on-one, if I'm fighting, and I have to assume in general that I'm fighting against someone with a shield. Great weapon, that's great. Pick the weapon you think gives you the best advantage in terms of range and mobility. But when you're fighting somebody with a shield, you really need to be able to respond with the idea that they're going to be able to close on you at some point. You want something that's maneuverable that you can still use on an offensive capacity once they get in tight. So, I got a couple of different great weapons here I want to show you. I'm going to describe to you how I kind of decided what length to make them. I'm going to start with, here's my 6 foot cutting spear. I'm 5'7", you can see this is 6 foot. It's a little longer than I am tall. This gives me decent range against my opponent, and it allows me a fairly good sized cutting area. Okay, because remember, it's not necessarily that I want to open up a big wound. I can't. That's not realistic. But it gives me a large range of area with which to hit my opponent. If I have a very small striking head, that becomes a targeting issue. That makes it more difficult for me to maneuver a strike in on my opponent. So while a lot of us love the look of, say, a warhammer, like a Lucerne hammer, which is more pointy than hammerish, but it's got the general hammer shape, or even just a regular war hammer, it's got a very small concentrated striking area because it was meant to power through plate armor. In our game, that means that's the only size of area that I've got to hit my opponent with. So that really limits my striking ability, and I've got to have really, really good targeting to make sure I'm hitting him with the head and not with the haft. So I've got a good sized cutting area here with which to be able to strike my opponent, and I've got 6 feet of range, but it's not so massive or unwieldy that once they get in tight on me, you could see, even if I've got it all the way down here, the head is still in a striking position. I can still hit my opponent even if they're in tight on me. If this was a foot longer, the bottom of the haft would already be digging into the ground, and to be able to bring it down far enough to choke up on it to hit my opponent, I now have to take and put the haft behind me, which now can limit me a little bit in how I respond and attack my opponent. So I want something that's long enough that it gives me a decent range advantage on my opponent. And I've got 6 feet of this, all right? But I want it to be short enough that if they get past that head and they manage to get in tight on me, that I still have a good offensive capacity that I can maneuver around their shield and strike them with until I can somehow manage to get back to where I'm once again at a range advantage to my opponent. So that's my 6-foot cutting spear. Now, next thing I have to show you here, this is my Dane axe or great axe. Now, again, this doesn't have a specific dimension. This actually is just a tiny bit longer than I normally do for myself. What I found for myself was the best way to measure the effective range for my great axe was I wanted a great axe. I'm going to tilt this down so I can demonstrate. I wanted a great axe that was just long enough that I could cup my hands over the top of the haft like this and then be able to rest my chin on it. Okay? So essentially the perfect length of great axe for me personally was chin to ground. Okay? This one ended up being just a tiny bit longer. I didn't measure the haft quite right. By the time I put the butt spike on it, it ended up being a couple of inches longer than I normally do. Not a huge adjustment for me. That 3 inches didn't really make a big difference. But just, again, what I'm trying to tell you in terms of figuring out the proper length for me was chin to ground. The Varangian Axe was noted in history as being as tall as the wielders were. Now, average height back then was between 5'5" and 5'7", and so the axes were very likely to be in that same range, anywhere from 5.5 feet tall to a few inches taller than that, maybe as high as 6 foot. All right, like my spear, but they said they were man height. So that's what I do for my great axe. Now, other one, this is my bastard sword. Now, the thing about bastard sword, it's also referred to as a 1.5-hand sword. The idea is bastard sword should be longer than a standard one-handed weapon so that you can get both hands on the grip. But was balanced in such a way that you could wield it one-handed. Okay, that was the general definition that I've always been told when I first started and through some of my research. Bastard sword could be wielded one- or two-handed. Now, great swords, that's a whole other subject on its own, but essentially a great sword could be anything from about this length to maybe a bit longer, like say my great axe in length, up to chin level, up to 6 feet long, and even sometimes I've heard of a few that were even a little bit longer. Thing to remember is, though, that great swords that got to that level, the Flamberg, the Zweihander, and so on, those were meant for warfare and to be used with formations. Often, they were kind of a support weapon to the big pike units. They would intersperse among the pike units, and then once the units engaged, they would move up and then attack the actual weapons of the opponents as much or more than they attacked the opponents. So once the pike units engaged, the Flambergs or the Zweihander men would move up into the front ranks and start attacking the enemy pikes. Knock the heads off, cut the pike, damage the weapons. They didn't, as some people have intimated, suddenly just charge out of their unit at the enemy pikes before they were engaged, because in essence at that point they're kind of throwing themselves away, throwing their lives away. It makes much more sense from a tactical standpoint that you wait until you've got engagement, then you move up, and that way you can attack the weapons and then move in on the unit. But this essentially is one of my bastard swords. I've made a couple of different ones. This one has a pretty long grip, so I can get really nice leverage action with the way that I strike it. And it's fairly short. Yes, it is. Right? This one actually is meant to be in a situation where my opponent has already closed on me. It's long enough that I can get a couple of strikes at them as they're moving in, but I'm really anticipating that they're going to be able to get in tight on me. Well, that might sound like a disadvantage, but it actually can be an advantage to me. That once I'm in that tight with a short, light, well-balanced weapon, that I can do things even when they're tight in on me, and have a lot of maneuverability. I can actually get my shoulder onto their shield, get my weapon past the edge of their shield, lever over to push the shield off, and now I've got a clear strike on them. The whole while, I'm still maneuverable enough here in the clench that I can block their offense on me. So, again, when we're talking lengths, that's what I'm looking for in a personal length weapon. I want something that's going to give me a good range advantage, like my 6-foot cutting spear or my Dane axe. Something that is light and maneuverable enough, such again as the great axes say, the bastard sword, that once the opponent has managed to close on me, I can still respond to them without getting caught up in the length of my weapon. So for singles fights, my personal view is just about anything over 6 feet can actually be more of a disadvantage than an advantage. You're really only going to get 1 or maybe 2 offensive strikes on your opponent before they manage to close on you. Why? I brought this up once before in one of my other videos. The reality is 90% of the fighters out there can move faster forward than you can move backwards. All right? So if they're going to want to close on you, chances are if you run straight backwards for them, they're going to run you down. In another video, I talked about that, so you can look that up. It's one of the great weapons videos, I believe, that deals with range. Maintaining your range. So, singles fights, 6 feet and under, is basically kind of the optimum range for single fighting. Now, war fighting, melee. This is almost useful in war and melee. And what I mean by almost useful, 6 feet does give me enough range to attack across my unit into the opposing unit, but I have to be right up there on my guys, right behind them, almost rubbing up against them, and that can lead to me interfering with what my shield men can do. So honestly, I'm not going to typically take a 6-foot polearm out in melee or war. I want something a bit longer than that. Now I'm going to add a caveat here. If what you're doing is simply unit versus unit. Like you will have sometimes, you know, my unit border watch against, say, one of the other local units from Barony of the Barony of the Marches of the Debated Lands. There you've got just 2 units, and that can break up real quickly into just 1 or 2s, okay? It doesn't stay unit to unit all that much. And so in a small engagement like that, a limited engagement like that, 1 unit versus 1 unit, yes, that can still be effective, especially if I'm on the flanks. But realistically, I would rather have something longer than that. I would rather have something that's 6.5 to 7 feet long for a unit-on-unit engagement, and then maybe carry a one-handed weapon as a backup in case I get closed on too much. 6.5 to 7 foot. When I'm out in war, okay, now this is where we're talking the big events where we may have 60, 70, 80, a couple hundred people out on the field all at once with large engagements and lots of people and big lines occasionally, or multiple unit versus multiple unit. Now I'm looking at my 7 to 7.5 foot weapons. I love my Halberd in that type of an engagement. If I'm going to be out there with multiple units in large engagements with lots of people, having that 7.5 foot Halberd is wonderful. You've got that head that can strike past the edge of a shield. You can hook shields and pull them down. You become a multi-purpose offense at that point, as opposed to just striking your opponent. Spears, great. 7 to 7.5 foot long spear with some cutting surfaces on it. You may not have quite the hooking ability that an axe does, but you've got cutting ability that the 9-foot spears or pikes don't have. In our game, 9-foot spears or pikes do not have cutting edges. They are thrusting weapons only. So you get up there with a 7 to 7.5 foot long spear like this one, with this type of a head on it, you're again a multi-purpose offense. You have the ability to not only thrust attack across your line into the opponent, you've got a cutting ability that can be very, very effective. So 7 to 7.5 feet weapons, what you want to do is not make the end of your weapon, your cutting head, so massive or heavy that it impedes your ability to maneuver it. But you do want to have a sufficient cutting surface, cutting edge, that you don't limit your strike ability as well. So for war, melee, halberds, glaives, spears. For small unit engagements, get in that 6.5 to 7 foot range. If you're going to be in war, where you've got large numbers of people and lots of group units versus group units, now that's when I'm pulling out the long range. That's when I'm pulling out the howitzer. I want that 7 to 7.5 foot range weapon. So there you have it. That is my advice in terms of trying to figure out the length. It is subjective to the person. It's subjective to the scenario that you're going to use it for. Are you using it for singles fighting? Are you using it for melee fighting, small unit engagements? Or are you using it for war, large field engagements with lots of units and lots of people? Give yourself some flexibility in the way that you're going to be able to approach your opponent. All right? Thank you, and I hope this was useful to you.